What do horror movie makers, predators, and frogs have in common, and how do they relate to international relations and the potential for war and peace? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we have our answer today. And this is just one of the more curious episodes that we've had in talking about the diplomacy since President Donald Trump has been entered into office, of how the war is going to be brought to an end, what the various sides are doing. We keep talking about how nearly everybody's moving in opposite directions. Nobody's moving in the direction of peace in the middle. And this is just the latest episode in that. And unfortunately, this just reiterates that we are nowhere closer to a diplomatic end to the Russia-Ukraine war than we've been really since all the way back to the beginning, maybe even since last summer. We just, no matter the optimism that entered into office with President Trump, and many people thought that there might actually be a path to a negotiated settlement, that seems to have been dashed. And just the events of just the last few days seem to reiterate that. And we'll see how the people on all sides continue to push back against this. Now, we're going to start off with the horror movie maker, because that's one that came actually from Vladimir Putin, who ordinarily doesn't use any kind of even potentially derogatory language to any of his diplomatic opponents, but he pulled one out here. Watch this.
It is your community, it is your family, so I don't want to put you in a difficult position and to criticize NATO and EU. I don't want to compare them to some reptiles or some animals. They are not specialists in fairy tales, they are specialists in horror films, because we can see all these hysterics being stirred up that Russia is planning to attack Europe, this frenzy. And we understand that it's a provocation, because any reasonable person is perfectly aware that Russia has never had any plans to attack anyone. As for the conflict in Ukraine, it has nothing to do with our aggression. It has to do with the West contributing to the state coup d'etat.
Now, obviously, one's perspective matters a lot on how some of those comments are reflected. But what it appears, anyway, that President Putin is meaning there is that he's saying, well, I'm not going to go down into the to the bottom and say, accuse of being reptiles and whatever, and using negative language which some people have applied to Russia and to Putin himself. But he rises just a little bit above that and says that they're actually movie makers. I've often used the term that it seems more like the European side and the Ukrainian side, or more on script makers, like they're just writing out the view of reality that they wish were true. So kind of like screenplay writers, I guess, so to speak. But Putin takes it in another direction and says the writing a screenplay specifically for a horror film, which, of course, they continue to claim that Russia has territorial ambitions to the West, that they're just this marauding band of attackers that are coming. They're like Hitler and the Wehrmacht from the Nazi Germanys, etc. And, of course, the Russians are saying, yeah, that's not the case. Now, of course, when Putin says things like, we're not attacking anyone, we're not the aggressors, and et cetera, well, that falls on deaf ears. In fact, it's going to get mocked in the West, because what we claim anyway was that Russia, with unprovoked and for no good reason, just woke up one day and attacked into Ukraine, and that just shows their territorial ambitions, et cetera. Look, the bottom line is that nobody is completely innocent here. Nobody's got clean hands. There are just sides with national interest and what they're going to do about it. And one of the biggest complaints that I've made is that while Russia is responsible for their actions and they chose to invade on February 2022, it didn't come out of nowhere. And it's not wise for us to continue to have pushed them over so many years, so many decades, even a solid 15 years. And you could go back all the way to 1997, but 2008 is a good place, because that's the first time that Putin really laid down a marker and said NATO and Ukraine is a red line for us, and we're not going to be sitting passive by when that happens. And they continued all the way up through right before it happens. And so it's foolish for us to think that all of our actions and the fact that we continue to move NATO up there, that we were increasing the NATO actions inside of Ukraine. And then, of course, the open declarations that no, it was inevitable they would be in NATO at some point, et cetera. all of those things finally had their reaction, and we were just playing with fire to think that it would never happen. There's no reason for us to have done that. It's important to understand our security was never at risk, and it was never going to be improved by bringing Ukraine into NATO. The only thing it could accomplish was to put a red cape in front of a bull, so to speak, and would cause the action that it did. We're never going to be safer because of Ukraine even possibly being in NATO. And by the way, it's even worse than that, because every NATO leader understood, and everybody in the West knew, that there was no chance that we were actually going to invite Ukraine into NATO. But instead of admitting the obvious and moving on forward and just dealing with reality, we kept with the fiction that, no, they're going to come in one day. So that's what we said publicly and openly and provocatively and confidently, that was going to be the case. And so the Russian side, they can't just assume that it's lying, and from their perspective, and that's why they took action. Again, I don't defend it. I'm just saying that it's foolish for us to think that it wasn't going to happen, and that's what he's talking about now. Now then, fast forward 3.5 years later, and Putin is saying, look, you guys are still on that same track. You keep talking about World War III. I showed you just a few days ago, France is telling its hospitals, hey, you need to start getting ready for a war next year. You need to ramp up to be able to hold up to, I think, 50,000 combat casualties. You got to have that kind of capacity next year. You've had just in recent months, you've had Mark Rutte from the NATO Secretary General says, hey, we got to be ready for war in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years against Russia. And that's just next door. We got to really ramp up. We have to do a rebuild Europe, etc. That's all you ever hear from the Western side, is that we have to get ready for war. We reject every diplomatic off-ramp that has ever existed, and we keep going down this path here. And so just like everything from 2008 up to 2022 had a natural reaction, we are again playing with fire if we think that these kinds of words also won't have a natural reaction. And Russia is putting a lot more actions on top of the words that they're saying that shows they too are getting ready for this. And this will be lose-lose for everybody. I used to think that up for until just recently that this war is already lost. That's a certainty. Ukraine side has lost it. The Western side has lost it. Russia's going to win it. The only question is, how bad and how ugly will the loss be? Will we do a negotiated settlement that's an ugly loss, or will we continue to resist reality and let it be a catastrophic loss for the Ukraine side? So those are the only two things that we have yet to determine. But I also thought that once that was over, then the risk of escalation was going to be, back to something close to normal. But now then I'm starting to wonder, we seem to be we didn't seem to have not learned the lesson in all of the 15 years prior to 2022. And we seem to be on steroids doing them again by giving Russia every reason to think that it needs to continue to escalate its own war preparation. And when you get two blocks and two sides that keep on doing this and getting ready for war, and they see this action, they see that action, and then they see the other action, they keep going up, etc., you have a situation to where you have potentially self-fulfilling prophecy. Both sides think the other side's going to go to war, and then one day that actually happens. Let's get off that damn road right now before we go any further. Neither side is going to go off of this willingly, so we're going to have some sanity come in soon. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot to go around on our side. So whereas Putin called the West, horror movie makers, Ursula von der Leyen has again repeated that she's calling Putin a predator.
We are also reflecting on the next steps and best use of these assets, because one thing is very clear. Russia, the predator, has to be held accountable for what it did, and has to pay. Has to pay for the damage and for the aggression. That has to be the principle, and therefore we are looking into an additional use of the windfall profits that are immobilized.
So you see, Russia has to pay. So again, sticking with the theme that is on the Western side pervasive, that the attack was unprovoked. We didn't do anything. We haven't learned any lessons there. So all the problems and all their causes and all the fault lies with the Russians, ergo they have to pay for what happened. No concept at all that this was a self-inflicted wound on our part, and no concept that we need to just get rid of this stupid war, get it off the table by whatever quick means we can. And then, yeah, of course, nobody should trust Russia. I wouldn't, especially if I was one of the countries that live on the edge. I would say whatever we need to do to ensure our national security within our ability to control, meaning our own national security forces. Fair enough. That's what you should do, actually. Don't trust Russia. Build up your national security and do whatever you need to do on your frontiers to prevent any kind of Russia from coming in the future, etc. But to outright seek confrontation and to continue to poke a finger in the chest of an already angry and growing bear seems pretty stupid to me. And to just continue to say Russia is a predator, you're telling everybody on your side, and you're telling the Russians how they're viewed on your side, is that a predator is coming after you. A predator isn't just like a bear in its cave. A predator is like a lion that comes out and seeks to devour somebody. And so that's how you're viewing the Russians, not as in their cave and they'll just be, they'll hibernate in there if you leave them alone. No, you're talking about like that they're a lion that's going to come out after you. And so that is animating what's going on here. Well, the Russians are seeing that. They're also going to react to that as well. Don't turn a bear into a lion. That's not good for anybody. But that is where we are. Now, that's not all of Europe, because there are some in Europe who, by the way, are very close to a border with Russia. One is right next to Ukraine, and that is Slovakia. Robert Fico has a different way to try and bring security for his country.
I started telling a story about a frog or about a toad. Sometimes I have an impression that many people in the European Union are like that frog that are sitting at the bottom of the well, and they cannot see what's happening there outside because the world is different from what they believe it is. And I'm very disappointed that in the European Union, despite I have utmost respect for the European Union, but it cannot react to the tensions in the world. And I fail to understand some decisions the European Union is making. So I would like to say directly, outright, that we are interested in standardizing relations between the Republic of Slovakia and the Russian Federation.
So, it's funny. We have all these analogies going first there. We have the horror movie makers, we have predators, and now we have frogs, curiously enough. So that's Robert Fico talking about his own side there. And he's saying, we're like a frog at the bottom of a well, that all you can see is what's directly above you. You have no idea what's happening elsewhere. And that's how he's viewing them. And they're not viewing things in their rational context. That, of course, has frustrated him for a long time. It's frustrated Hungarian Prime Minister as well. And we've shown him many times. But he's saying, listen, the best path to security is to have a normal relation with Russia. Again, this idea that Russia has this conquest mentality belies actual evidence. Since 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, how many countries has the Soviet Union invaded? The answer is none, other than Ukraine in 2022. And we talked about the reason why Russia chose to do that, because they felt like that you were moving this military alliance up to their doorstep. Short of that, even when the Baltics came into NATO, that didn't prompt Russia to invade. They chose not to do that. They have not said that they want to invade anybody else. And prior to, and I think this is also mentioned by the Russian side, prior to 2014, when the West supported the overthrow of the legally elected government because it was friendly towards Moscow, and they didn't care about democracy. We didn't care about democracy or the will of the people or anything like that. We supported the overthrow of the government because it suited our purposes. And so that's where we went. And that was the initial sin here. Prior to that, understand this, prior to that, Russia had done nothing other than they had a border skirmish with Georgia, which had very limited military objectives, which, by the way, was started by the Georgian side, not the Russian side. And that was also on the heels of saying that they're not going to allow Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Russia at that time had a very limited military engagements, and only a couple of provinces within the country of Georgia, which they took advantage of when the Georgian president Saakashvili, who I think thought NATO was going to have his back because they said that they would come in there, took provocative action and actually started the attacks against the Russian peacekeepers. Putin took full advantage of that and then moved in to make sure that now that they would never be in NATO, and that's where it ended. But other than those two specific issues directly related to NATO, Russia did not do anything. And prior to the whole NATO thing in the 2014, we got the situation to where the Russia had not done anything to anybody. Ukraine still owned even Crimea and all of the Donbass, everything. There was no shortage of that. But because we kept pushing a bad situation, it continues to go forward. Prior to the 2014, Russia posed no threat to anybody. There's no reason to think that Russia would again now decide to conquer more territory when nobody's talking about moving NATO any more closer to the Russian side. Ergo, that's why they keep saying to solve this problem, we need to get to what they call the root causes, which is NATO in Ukraine. Once you take that off the table, and then they've added the denazification, demilitarization to it, because Russia says they no longer trust us. I mean, we talk about not trusting Putin. Well, he doesn't trust our side either. And now then that's additional components to end that war. But none of those things affect any other country in Europe. And there's no reason to think that that's going to change it. There's no evidence of that. Only the claims without substance that's claimed. In fact, I think I showed you a clip just a couple of days ago of what's his name, General Jack Keane, where he says, of course, Russia wants to continue going forward, and they can want to continue to attack into West. He says everybody knows it. Well, no, everybody doesn't know. There is no evidence. He even said Putin keeps saying it over and over. No, he doesn't. He says the opposite over and over, but people don't actually listen, or they don't care. And so they just ascribe to Russia things that they don't say, actually, because we want to build up, a predator image. We want to build up someone who's going to attack. They want to build up a Hitler too kind of guy. And that's not going to be good for anybody. All that's going to do is end up leading us into a war that we should never, never fight. Okay. One of the other things that has been happening recently in terms of people calling people out and looking at how diplomacy is going, you may recall that a couple of weeks ago, President Trump made another deadline. He said, well, we'll know in a couple of weeks if this is going to happen. But based on the Alaska meeting with Putin and Trump in person, and then the Washington meeting that happened right after that with Zelensky and then the European leaders, he said the next thing they were excited about was a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and then a trial that would add Trump to hopefully bring the war to an end. They were saying maybe that would be done by the end of August, but then Trump put a 2-week deadline, which according to Macron expired on Monday. And in fact, he did not hesitate to call that out. But let's first of all, before we talk about what Macron said, I want to talk about what the Russians said, because Putin did say they're willing to consider some kind of a bilateral negotiation. But as Peskov pointed out, there were some conditions.
Возможности проведения такой встречи, но считает, что любая встреча на высшем уровне должна быть хорошо подготовлена, с тем, чтобы на ней можно было финализировать те наработки, которые предварительно должны быть осуществлены на экспертном уровне. Пока нельзя сказать, что экспертная работа, скажем так, бурлит. Нет, к сожалению, нет. Мы сохраняем свою заинтересованность и свою готовность к таким переговорам.
So, very straightforward. We're interested in talking about those. We're interested in having negotiations. That's what we've said throughout. We've never said anything different, and we reiterate it now. That's where the Russian position is. But he said before you can get heads of state together, you're going to have expert level technical talks. So things have to be worked out so that there's something for these heads of state leaders to agree upon when they get there. That's normal. That's how it ordinarily happens. In fact, what happened with Trump and Putin in Alaska was uncommon because they didn't have all that stuff worked out first. They actually did it. That's what ordinarily a working group would do. But for some reason, Trump thought it would be good to do it at the heads of state level. Well, that's fine if that's what both Trump and Putin want to do. But in terms of Putin and Zelensky, he is definitely not going to do that. Trump is trying to mediate an end to the war. But Zelensky is the protagonist. He is the enemy of Russia. Russia is the enemy of Ukraine. So before those two guys can meet, it's reasonable that there has to be some kind of something close to an agreement so that they can tie the knot or seal the final deal, etc. None of that stuff has happened. So Russia's statement very clearly is we are willing to have a bilateral as long as these technical talks at the expert level happen first, right? That's the position. But then what you have, the way it's characterized on the West, somewhat different. Here is Emmanuel Macron last Friday talking about how he wants to see some action on Monday.
À l'issue de la longue réunion que nous avons eue ensemble il y a quelques semaines à Washington, l'appel a donné lieu à 7 propositions du président Poutine au président Trump. Je vais voir le président Zelensky. Si ça n'est pas tenu lundi, échéance qui avait été fixée par le président Trump, je crois qu'une fois encore, ça voudra dire que le président Poutine se sera joué du président Trump. Je pense que ce n'est pas une bonne chose. Ce n'est pas une bonne chose pour nous tous, et donc ça ne peut pas rester sans réponse. Et donc les prochains jours, je pense, seront consacrés. Nous parlerons l'un et l'autre au président Trump dans le week-end. Nous verrons lundi ce qu'il en est. J'espère que cette réunion va se déclencher et se tiendra. J'espère que la réunion trilatérale se tiendra.
So you see, I still hope that meeting will happen. But in case you couldn't read some of those words, I know they were kind of small on there. He's saying, listen, when we had that meeting in Washington, we gave him 2 weeks. That 2-week deadline for a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin expires on Monday. He said this last past Friday. So he said, and if there is no meeting by then that means that Trump was played again. No concept, and Peskov's words are hardly unknown. He knew full well what this Russian situation is, what their position is, because they had been saying it almost from the very beginning, from the first time that an idea of a bilateral meeting was mentioned. They kept saying that over and over. We've shown you on here, Sergei Lavrov reiterated that firmly. So Macron knows that Russia said they're open to it, but these lower level meetings have to take place first. Not only did they not even attempt to have those meetings because he didn't want them to, so he just ignores them as though they didn't happen because he knows that people in the West, and certainly in Europe and in France, are going to be doing what you're doing here, is watching a comprehensive view to where you see all of the players and what they're saying put together. They want to hide that and make it sound like that Russia's just not playing ball, that there's playing Trump, that he promised that he would meet Zelensky and now he's not doing it. That's how they're characterizing a known lie. They know that's untrue, but they're saying it to their population because they want them to believe something untrue, again, to cast the Russian side in a bad light, that they can't be trusted. There's no point in having a negotiation with them. They never do what they say they're going to do, etc. And there's just no truth to that. They would never do the same thing under other circumstances if they were in a protagonist situation and they're in this position of superiority. They would never agree to an unconditional meet with the guy on the bottom unless something had been worked out first. I mean, I doubt they would. I wouldn't. That would be ridiculous to do. But in any case, they are preventing you and deceiving people from thinking that there's just an unwillingness on the Russian side when there's a perfect willingness on the Russian side. And listen, this is kind of similar to what happened with when Trump first came into office and with his first ultimatum that he gave to Russia, which is you will agree to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire or there will be consequences. That's what he said before. And that's what they're doing here. And the Russians said in response to that, they said, we're willing to consider a ceasefire, not an unconditional one, though. There's going to be some conditions. And if you'll meet these conditions, then we'll consider that. But we didn't want that. We only want what we want because we wrote the script. And the script says that we impose an unconditional 30-day ceasefire on Russia with no conditions, even though they're in the position of superiority militarily, diplomatically, industrially, etc. Don't care. That's not in our script, so we're not going to do that. Well, Russia doesn't care what's in your script. They only care what's real on the ground. And they only care what they can and what they cannot do. And they're not going to be swayed by your preference in your script from a position of weakness. But that's where we're going. Now, Macron is not the only one who's making that kind of statement. You also had Zelensky kind of diss Trump himself also on Friday.
Couple of weeks. When we spoke, it means 2-3 weeks. Just to remind to everybody through your chems, that 2 weeks will be on Monday.
So he just wanted to remind everybody, you guys in camera, i.e. Donald Trump, that if there's no meeting by Monday, which of course he knew for sure there wasn't going to be, because he guaranteed you Zelensky knew for sure what the Russian side said that they need as a prerequisite to that meeting. And of course, Zelensky is no chance he's going to go and make a meeting like that with something having been worked out first, because the only way that Putin, from a position of strength, is going to meet with Zelensky is if they're going to talk about the capitulation of the Ukraine side and their withdrawal from the territories of the 4 oblasts that Russia has annexed. He's definitely not going to do that, so he's not going to meet. But you saw he actually had a gleeful look on his face that he said, if there's no meeting by Monday, and he knew 100% sure there wouldn't be, well, then the deadline was passed, and so let's see what there's going to be some action, because that was Trump's original statement, apparently, that there would be some consequences. So they want consequences. Well, as you see, Monday came and went, and there was no consequences. That's been the pattern of Trump from the beginning. He's made a number of declarations and a number of ultimatums he's given in timeframes, and they all passed without action. And there was no consequences to any of it. And he keeps talking about he may bring these bone-crushing sanctions and all this. We've talked about that a bunch of times. There's no chance it's going to make anything change. It's not going to affect Russian actions, and it's probably going to harm our interests. And so that's one of the reasons why Trump has wisely not done it. And I hope that he does it again. I just wish he would stop making these claims so that he doesn't have to be shown as not being a man of his word, because that undercuts anything in the future, he would say, because people aren't going to believe. He may one day end up doing some of these things and harm us anyway. I hope he doesn't. But by making these claims and putting deadlines out there and making ultimatums that you don't fill, it just completely undercuts anything in the future you say. So why is anyone going to listen to you then if none of the other stuff since you've been in office this time have come to pass? So that's not a helpful thing. And in fact, Callis, basically the foreign minister for the European Union, I think she's the vice president of the union, seemed to take both Putin and Trump to task.
How do you evaluate Donald Trump's diplomatic efforts up until now?
Everybody welcomes the diplomatic efforts made by President Trump. It's just the problem is that Putin is mocking those attempts. Everybody else is welcoming because the Europeans want peace, Ukrainians want peace, and Americans want peace. Who doesn't want peace is Putin. So it takes at least 2 to want peace. It only takes 1 to want war. And as long as Russia still wants war, there's no peace.
Well, I mean, you can almost like flip her words around and say, yeah, if there's one who doesn't want peace, it's Volodymyr Zelensky. Russia does want peace. They have offered it repeatedly, and we have chosen not to. But it's not just him, of course. It's Callis, etc., because then she, again, reverts back to the screenwriter view of foreign policy and scripts out how she would like the world to be, which is that we seek peace and Russia doesn't seek peace. Of course, translated into normal English, into regular human being language, is that from a position of weakness and inferiority, we are demanding that the side that's the superior side militarily and diplomatically and industrially, we demand that they meet our terms, and they're not going to. But she said they're the only ones who don't want peace. No, they don't want peace on your terms. And they're only offering them on the positive terms. I mean, we're not even accepting peace terms when we're in the minority and in the inferior position. Imagine if we were in the position of superiority and the Russians had been demanding something, how much more we would mock them for having the audacity to suggest that. And yet, that is precisely what we're asking the Russians to do, something we would never do. And that's another consistent theme that we've been doing, which is why we're in this place in the first place. We're asking Russia to be okay with moving a military alliance directly up to their borders when not one country in the West would be okay if the reverse were happening. If Russia were moving a military alliance closer to the West, we would never tolerate, but we expect the Russians to. We expect the Russians from a position of strength to give in to our demands from a position of inferiority. It's never going to happen. You can write whatever script you want, but the minute that you put it on the ground in reality, it gets bloodied and burned up. because it can't stop a bullet. A screenplay, you can hold it up in front of your chest, but that bullet's going to fly right through it as though it wasn't there. And that's what exactly is happening on the ground. And the Russians are just saying, you guys can keep going with your horror movie, as Putin put it, because that's what it's turning into for the Ukrainian people. Because this always comes back to, I say this so many times, it matters what you can do, and it matters what you can't do. And when spin comes into contact with reality, reality will impose itself over spin every time. It's done that throughout this whole episode, and it's happening right now as we speak. And as the longer the West and the Ukrainian side resist reality, acknowledging what's true and what's real on the battlefield, and the capacity and the potential for war-making capacity on the two sides, which is grotesquely out of balance in Russia's favor, the more horror we're going to see on the ground. The more Ukrainians are going to die, the more territory is going to be lost, the more cities are going to be destroyed. It's just, it's played out that way all the way through, and it's going to continue to play that way, and there is no prospect for it to be militarily reversed. And that point was underscored in Beijing earlier today when President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin met together. And of course, this is on the heels of the SCO meeting that has happened. It's in the context of the expanding BRICS economic bloc. It's on top of them talking more and more about forming a new center of balance and a new center of power in global politics. And the center of gravity is moving in their direction. And our side, just like on the battlefield in Ukraine, is weakening because of our abject unwillingness to see reality. And I want you to show you what happened just earlier today in Beijing and what the two sides said together, and notice how they're focused not just on bilateral issues, but on international ones.
China-Russia relations have withstood the test of the international situation and serve as a model of interstate relations. Eternal good neighborliness, friendship, comprehensive strategic interaction, mutually beneficial cooperation, and win-win outcomes. In recent years, under our leadership, China and Russia, in the spirit of their original goals and with determination, have been achieving fruitful results in cooperation. We are ready, together with you, to continue supporting each other in national development and prosperity, to steadfastly defend international justice and equality, and to promote the formation of a more just and rational system of global governance. Our close communication reflects the strategic nature of Russia-China relations, which are at an unprecedentedly high level. This was fully demonstrated during your May visit to Russia and our joint participation in the celebration of the 85th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. Tomorrow in Beijing, large-scale solemn events will be held on the occasion of the 85th anniversary of the victory over Japan and the end of the Second World War, in which we will take part together. And you have just said that there might even be rain, but I am sure that this will not overshadow our festive mood. And the Chinese armed forces, with their customary brilliance, will carry out this festive, solemn event.
So you see, they're very festive. They're not worried. They're not thinking that they're losing a war. In fact, they're festive because they see that things are trending in their favor. They see that more and more people are looking to the east. They're not looking to the west. Our side is getting weaker. Their side is getting stronger. I showed you yesterday that video of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Modi from India greeting like they were high school best friends, just all happy, holding hands, giving hugs, smiling like they were, almost like they were dating each other. I mean, it was really big stuff. Yeah, that's the one right there. You see, they're holding hands right there. Now they're going to come up here with, now they're meeting Xi Jinping, and there's warm handshakes and all this kind of stuff. That's why they're all happy, because they're seeing that their actions are succeeding. They're moving the needle in their direction, and the center of gravity in world politics and world economics is moving in their direction at their advantage. And the longer we keep going with this fiction that we're writing, and the more it runs into reality, both on the battlefield and in economics, the worse it's going to be for us. it can continue to get worse. And of course, the absolute worst is not just that they're economically in a better position than we are. We can probably survive that. The problem is if we keep going down this path, we may end up having that self-fulfilling prophecy I mentioned earlier. We may end up being in a conflict with Russia. And because nuclear weapons are involved, United States, France, Great Britain, and then there's nuclear weapons on the Russian side. They don't need any from anyone else, but they also have North Korea on their side. They could potentially have China on their side, especially if this thing escalates and it becomes an interstate war. And if anybody uses nuclear weapons, then everything is on the table that could happen, everything bad. We should not even be toying with this. Just imagine, folks, imagine right now, you can suffer some embarrassment. And you can say, all right, this was stupid. We should never have done it. We had so many diplomatic off-ramps that would have been ended the war at a lot lower cost. And we foolishly went down that we just wrote a script and said, we don't care about reality. Reality imposed itself, smashed into us. And now we're in an even worse situation here. But it still is not unrecoverable for us. None of our troops have died. None of our militaries have been destroyed. None of our territory has been taken. None of our cities have been wiped out. So let's end the war here right now and start getting back to any kind of normalized relation. It's going to take a long time to get some of this healed, but we can get back to it right now and we'll be in good shape. And then we can start maybe reversing some of this economic decline, because now then not having to worry about supporting a foolish war, we can start doing some other things as well. We can start trying to outcompete China and Russia and giving people a reason to want to do business with us. That'd be really hard, but it is still possible. That's what we should do right now. That's what's the most rational and logical for our interest. The worst thing we can do, though, is to keep writing a damn script that's in contradiction to reality. Because taken far enough, we could end up in a war that we cannot win and could well lose. And again, God forbid if it should go nuclear, then everyone loses. And that would be the worst outcome for mankind. But that's where we're at, folks. That's the state of affairs here and what's at stake here. It's not just a matter of keeping face or whatever or looking tough. Those times are past. It's time to get into the brass tacks of reality before we really get into trouble. It's not too late. So we can still right this ship and do the right thing and get this war over with and get back to the business of trying to create prosperity for our populations and our various countries and not supporting war. That's where we are. Thanks for being with us today, folks. I really appreciate your time and your attention here. There's going to be a show this afternoon at 2 p.m. with author Peter Turchin, who wrote a book called The End Times, in which he's one of the guys that actually predicted political instability in the United States in 2020. And he did it, I think it was in 2010. So he really looked and read the tea leaves and has a lot of scientific information behind him. And he is even more concerned now about political instability in the United States than he was before. And so it's a legitimate question. Is societal collapse looming for America? Are we still going down a path even worse than it was in 2020? We're going to have him on today, and he's going to give us his assessment of where the United States is and what we can do domestically to avoid that very bad outcome. Thanks very much, folks. We'll see you at 2 o'clock on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.